Emily asked me to give a quick state of the internet and social media in order to kind of warm up the presentations, which is an enormous task that I happily took on because it's something that I take a look at every once in a while, maybe once every 6 months, to see what the trends are. And so I am fairly familiar with where are we going in terms of social media as a whole, in terms of an outreach platform. The reason that I'm here today not talking about my usual topic of forest pests and firewood is because I'm currently doing a part-time fellowship with the Fire Adapted Community Learning Network with you all as part of one of TNC's sort of learning exchange programs that they do, which is called a CODA Fellowship, named for a gentleman with the last name of CODA. And that's why I'm here. So I appreciate the opportunity to learn from all the work that you guys do, and so I'm glad to be also giving back on some of the work that I do for my own program. Let's see, flip slide, there, got it. Okay, so the most important thing to think about with social media is that they are merely another tool in the toolbox. There's a lot of sort of angst and generational differences when it comes to social media, but the reality is that they're just another way to get information to people that you need to reach. So the number one thing that you should always take into account with any messaging, as I'm sure every one of you knows, is that you have to know the who you want to reach before you can do anything else. So what is your target audience for the piece of information or the professional networking that you're trying to accomplish? And that will drive all of your following actions. But when we talk about social media, then after that, we have to dive into the next line, which is knowing the demographics of each social media platform so that you don't waste your time on the wrong platform. Social media is not just a little thing that you do every once in a while to keep up with the Joneses, of course. It's something that you actually need to commit to as part of your outreach program. And so nobody wants to waste their time on the wrong platform or the wrong account in order to reach the who of who they want to reach. The other thing is that depending on your messages, oh, there you go. So Emily just put up my main link, if everyone can look in the chat box, for where I get a lot of this information. Pew Internet is it's part of the Pew Charitable Trust, and it's a nonprofit, which is kind of nice because a lot of the internet and social media survey materials that you'll find on the web are by the for-profit companies themselves, and I sometimes question some of their trend information as being potentially more profit-driven than reality-driven. The fact that the Pew is, you know, with a completely separate third-party, non-interest conflicted group is, I think, helpful. Okay, but back to where I was. So making an informed choice about your time is really important. The first picture I put up on the left, which has small text, which I apologize for, is a sample graphic off of the Pew Internet information site that I like to use that just has Facebook demographics for 2015, essentially second quarter. And you can see there's some really interesting, perhaps non-intuitive things going on there. One of them, for instance, is that if you look at age 65 and over, 50% of internet users now over the age of 65 use Facebook. This was unheard of when I started using social media at the beginning of my position with the Nature Conservancy. That number was almost 0. We're now up to 50%. Likewise, the older millennials and mid-generation X to late generation X demographic of 30 to 49 is now essentially tied with millennials at 82% of users now using Facebook. So Facebook used to be something for the college kids, let's put that in quotes, but now it's really reaching across all the demographic groups, and that's a big change over time. And I think it really suggests what I advise everyone to do is know the who of you want to reach, and then pick from there. That has changed greatly. When I started doing social media for my position with the Nature Conservancy, We started out using a MySpace account, which now would get you laughed out of the room. The only reason that you would use a MySpace account now is if you were a singer or a songwriter, which is perfectly legitimate, but that's not what I do. So these graphics are super useful. I highly recommend you bookmark the site, take a look at it every once in a while. You'll be really shocked sometimes at what's going on. Let me take you to the next slide. The 5 biggest platforms that are in use today by people who are in the adult range of ages. So we're not talking about very young people, teenagers under 18, I'm ignoring. Because they're not a professional target for our work at this time. But for all the people from 18 to infinity, these are the main platforms that they use. And you can see Facebook is still extremely dominant, but Pinterest is actually growing, which I personally, from my work, tend to ignore Pinterest because it's quite high effort, and for what I do, I'm pretty sure it would be relatively low return. However, for what you all do, because it has a very strong visual component with forests and fire and landscaping and landscapes, I think Pinterest could be a really interesting place for you all to do outreach as a concept. So if you're dismissing Pinterest because you think it's only for people who need to figure out how to decorate a birthday cake, that is its predominant use, but it's growing rapidly. It is becoming less gendered, so it used to be 90% women, and it is coming down in that gender split and becoming closer to even, although it's still dominated by women. So that's one example of outreach target that's really been changing over time, even beyond just changes in demographics. That one's also changing in gender by use. Instagram is dominated by younger people, and it's also extremely visual. It essentially does not allow for text, more or less. And so that could be really productive for the demographics that you all are looking at, depending on what your message is. And then going down the line to LinkedIn, LinkedIn is dominated by very high income groups, relatively speaking, in that it's middle class to upper socioeconomic groups. It's got very little contribution by the lowest participation, it's got very little participation by the lower economic groups because it's really mostly used by business sectors. Now, for all of us, as people that are working with other professionals in the field very consistently, LinkedIn could be a really interesting way to reach out to fellow professionals that maybe you're having a hard time getting a hold of either in your community or cross-community networking. So that's one that could potentially be useful. And then Twitter. I have found that Twitter is the new news wire. It is on this chart the least used of the 5 major platforms, but it's extremely helpful for inter-organizational relationships and information sharing. So when Twitter started out, it was built as this very sort of open source platform where you could do almost everything and nothing simultaneously, which gave it a bad rap when it went public. But now, because of the increased use and also adoption by Facebook of the Twitter hashtag system, you really can do some excellent research and information sharing on Twitter, especially between different organizations. I'm seeing that there's some lively chat going on, so let me take a quick look at that to make sure that I'm not missing something. So analytics on Pinterest, that brings up such a great point. One of the pluses and minuses of social media is that they have usually really good analytics, but you can get really lost in the minutia, and it can get very frustrating, partially because all the social media platforms to some extent use algorithms in order to show or not show materials to people. So that's something that I'll cover later in my presentation, but it's a little bit of a complication in terms of seeing your actual impact. So let's see. So Emily mentions that Pinterest and Instagram are very visual, so they require a very wide-ranging photo library, which is definitely more time-intensive than Facebook or Twitter, which both can be used with just text-based messages and posts if necessary. Instagram, because it is very youth-based right now, I think the outdoor industry really likes it because of the sportiness and the almost like the romance of putting a picture of somebody in a beautiful setting. So that's to your advantage as well if you're trying to reach younger people or recreationalists for any of your needs. You know, that might not be a great place to reach, for instance, a second homeowner, but it could be a really great place to reach campers as an example of two different demographics that you would need two different approaches for. And let's see, yes, tracking likes and pins and things like that can be really productive. We'll talk about that a little bit more in my second presentation. And yeah, then the Wendy adds as the final chat before I hand this back over to Emily, that a lot of the national forests right now use Twitter through their information officers to inform the public about prescribed burns. That is an excellent example of how professionals are using Twitter as like a news wire. I know that in my community, when there is some sort of a crisis, like for instance, there was an armed robbery recently in my community, which is like unheard of, right? And so they had these street closures, and there was no good way for me to find out about the street closures except for on Twitter. I think there's a really solid parallel there between, for instance, a prescribed burn or a non-prescribed naturally started burn, and the need to get information out somewhere reliable, somewhere that's on an account that's viewable by the public where they can look for it. Kate, you accidentally, I think, sent that privately as opposed to everybody, but Kate Lighthall says, Periscope is starting to be utilized live streaming on incidents, and maybe that is an option for Trex events. Yes, so Periscope is essentially like an app in order to live stream. The tricky thing, because live streaming means you can't take it back. There's no delay, and so if something goes wrong, you're live streaming it, which I personally think is very nerve-wracking. You know, the examples of this are police chases should never be live streamed because you don't know what's going to happen next, etc. Now, I don't think that's really a likely scenario for a Trex event, but it is important to think about, you know, the possible disaster and legal and mitigation type scenarios that could happen with something like an emergency incident being live streamed. Okay, so Michelle adds, and then I'm really going to cut myself off, a wiki site on using Twitter for emergencies. Excellent resource. I think it's a really helpful place. And again, you're not using Twitter in that scenario to reach out to the public on a day-to-day basis. You're reaching out to people when they have a distinct need for information. So that's a different demographic. That's emergency communications on Twitter versus if you had a more consistent profile and a consistent outreach need, which might be better for a different platform, something more like Facebook or potentially Instagram. So I urge everybody to take a look at the Pew Internet site and kind of educate themselves when they start any kind of social media investigation before committing to a platform, to make sure that you're picking out one that's, first of all, rising, not falling in popularity. That's a good call. And then also one that has a demographic that's well suited to your needs, whether that's in terms of reaching wide ranges of people, which would be Facebook, reaching younger people, which could potentially be Instagram, reaching people in a professional setting or a crisis communication setting, which would be more suitable to Twitter. So